Hello, my name is Jack, and this is my direct video for Class 539. In a recent podcast that I created, I talked about how we can increase student engagement and some strategies to increase student engagement in the classroom. And today I kind of wanted to talk about an informational direct video that kind of builds off that. So I kind of want to talk about how we can build trust in the classroom and some strategies that I learned in my student teaching experience that kind of created strong relationships with my students and kind of ways that can, foster academic success and create healthy relationships and build trust. So the first tip that I have is to really listen to your students. Actively listening to your students is super, super important to kind of learn about what their motivations are, what their desires are, what works for them, what doesn't. It's really vital information as you know in the first couple weeks as a teacher, a first year teacher or a student teacher. So for me, I always kind of one tip that I have is I took kind of physical and mental notes in the first couple weeks of my students as they were talking to me. That way I could have learned about my students, if they were having a tough day or they needed a behavior reset, things like that. That's a really good tip that I kind of learned. Kind of to build off that, my next tip is to really ask your class questions constantly. I think it's super, super important for students to kind of, know that their voice matters in your classroom. So I was a history teacher in the high school level, and we often had classroom discussions. And, sometimes we had a couple debates in there about current events or about a specific historical event, or maybe how they interpreted a primary source or secondary source like that. So my class had a lot of discourse in it. And I thought it was super important, to ask them how they feel about something or have them elaborate on why they felt that way about a specific topic. And I think that's a really great way to build trust. But I also think it's really important for you as the teacher to be the facilitator in those discussions, and you're the leader, so you have to set an example in those discussions. So that way, it creates a healthy discussion that does not get out of hand. But those discussions, my students love them. I love them. They were probably my favorite part about teaching, kind of getting the students' opinions about how they interpreted a primary source or how they viewed, a specific current event that relates to our content. And it was really great. So, and, that's kind of what we kind of all learned about each other during those discussions. So I definitely think you should always ask your class questions. But in terms of, and like as a response to that, I think you should always respond intentionally as a teacher. Each student is different, so it's really important to critically think about like who your students are, what they believe, the background of where your students have came from, how they like feedback. That's something that's super, super important. Each student may need to provide feedback in a different way, present feedback in a different way. That's one thing I had to learn. So when you're responding to certain things or responding to comments or questions or anything like that, you may have to respond to your student in a different way because that's how they, that's how they think, and that's kind of how you have to, and that's kind of how they learn. So you have to make sure you respond to the students intentionally so they can learn and kind of create that healthy discourse. But in kind of to build off that as well, another tip that I have is to acknowledge students' feelings. This is probably the most important thing that I've learned as a student teacher. It's something that I was kind of nervous about talking about at first in my classroom, but using empathy in your class, telling your students that they're not alone is super, super important. In middle school and high school, it's such a tough age. And some students, it's the time of their life for some students, and some students are really struggling, and you never know. So it's always really important to be there for the students and, encourage vulnerability and, let a student know that a situation may also have hurt my feelings or cause them, maybe they made a mistake, and you can talk about it after class. Create that environment where they're comfortable about talking about things. They don't need to talk to you about it, their whole life story, but at the end of the day, it's important to create that environment where if the student does have something that's on their mind, you can be that person for them to talk to. After class, sometimes students would come to me right before lunch and talk about certain things that they needed to talk about. And it's great because you kind of build those build those relationships with them, but it also shows that you care and you're not just the history teacher. You're something that they look up to as well. So definitely kind of acknowledging the students' feelings is super, super important. Another thing that I kind of learned as my experience kind of progressed was to advocate for your students. This can mean a ton of things, ton of different things, but I think just showing them your support in certain situations is super helpful, and they notice those things for sure. Just so make sure you advocate for your students in a situation that you can. The one thing that I talked about is telling the students about yourself. I was super nervous to do this at first, and it did take me a couple weeks, but allowing the students to get to know you is like huge. Seeing you as a real person helps them to trust you and shows you that you're just not the history teacher, like I said earlier. Share good news with them, tell them about like a new dog or your relationship, or that you've experienced hurt and loss, and they may find strength in that. Like you sometimes teachers, I think, are scared, and I wish some of my teachers would actually been more open with me in high school and middle school, because I really needed that as a student growing up. And so as a student teacher, that's what I tried to be for my students, and definitely my students responded to that, and it's something that I definitely took as a helpful tip to build trust. Another thing is just little things like attending community events. It could be their sporting events. It could be their musicals. It could be, their art shows. It could be whatever. Just showing them that you support them. They'll feel so much closer to you in those small moments, and definitely appreciate what you're doing. And that can go along to remembering dates, birthdays. Maybe they won a sectional championship or a state championship. Showing those students that you care is super, super important. And building trust is not easy, and it takes time, but these are the things that I kind of experienced as a student teacher that really helped build trust and kind of create that healthy learning environment. So thank you.